Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jeff, and this is Not Just Book Reviews. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about Robert E. Howard, and more specifically, the short story Beyond the Black River, which is a Conan short story, and my favorite of the Conan short stories. So I wanted to make this video because, first of all, Michael K. Vaughan makes awesome videos about Robert E. Howard over on his channel, and I was so blown away that someone was into Howard on BookTube and they were talking about his books. And I'm going to link Michael's videos down in the description box because they're awesome. And I could tell he's like a deep Howard reader, which is great. I haven't read a lot of the non-Conan stuff yet, but I'm really looking forward to doing it. So I wanted to do this because there's a Conan problem in that the public perception of Conan has just become so divorced from the literary character of Conan, and it's a shame. There's a big problem with just you ask anyone on the street, Conan the Barbarian, oh, he's some big dumb Arnold Schwarzenegger with a sword, and it's not Conan. Like, it's just not who he is. And they tried to bring him to the screen 3 times, right? They tried, well, actually 4 times, right? Conan the Barbarian, which is a John Milius film, which is a good movie in its own right. Like, it's a good sword and sorcery movie, especially for the 80s. Blade Master, anyone? So it was a good movie, but it totally doesn't get Conan at all. And then they did Conan the Destroyer, which was even dumber than Conan the Barbarian. And then they did the Conan TV series with Ralph Mueller, the big goofy guy, but he was like, again, he was not just a big goofy dude, And then they updated it recently with Jason Momoa, who was marginally better in that he was a little more canny and a little more slick and cunning than the other 2 guys, but still. So I wanted to talk about my perception of Conan and what I think Howard's Conan is, and at heart what he is. And I want to use this story too to kind of explore that, because I think in this story, unlike a lot of other stories, it really gets at the essence of the character. So for me, Conan is not the hero's journey. He's not Aragorn. He's not the typical fantasy hero that you read about in fantasy series and in books. He's not that guy. He's a classic rogue, But what Conan really is, he's a military contractor. That's who Conan is. That's his character. He's a military contractor. He's very smart. He's tough as nails. He's strategic. But he's also not very complicated, and he's not that deep. In a weird way, he's not that interesting a character outside of his military and violence prowess. Like that stuff, he's fascinating because when you read Conan, you're in the mind of Conan as he's figuring out how to beat enemies and how to figure out how to beat armies and how to beat wizards and dragons and, well, never really a dragon, I should say. But the point is, it's fascinating because Conan's got game. He's got all this military and martial skill, and that's what all he's about. He's a very workmanlike dude. He's all about like let's get the next treasure, let's win the next battle. And then there's, of course, one woman in song, but that's not Conan. I mean, it's not really at the core of who he is either. He doesn't have great loves, although Belit, obviously could be one of them. But anyway, he doesn't fit into the 2 main paradigms which we have now in fantasy and visual fantasy, which is Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, right? Those are the 2 things that the people with the big money making these fantasy movies, that's all they know. Like, is it Lord of the Rings or is it Game of Thrones? And if it's not either one of those, I don't know what it is, and we can't afford to make it. So anyway, I want to talk about Conan, and I want to get into this story because it's a great story. But I want to show you kind of why I think this is Conan the military contractor. Like, I think this is what he is, right? So anyway, Beyond the Black River. So Beyond the Black River was written in the 30s, published 1935. And it takes place in the latter part of Conan's career. So there is, even though Howard didn't publish things in kind of chronological order, he just wrote stories. I think Phoenix on the Sword might have been the first story, and that was when Conan was already king. And the Tower of the Elephant was probably one of the earliest in his career, but that maybe came somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure. I'm not a Howard expert. So Howard experts out there, please, give me some slack, because I'm trying, but I'm not perfect with him. But so he, right now, at some point, Conan becomes king of Aquilonia. But so this is a little bit before this, where he's actually working for the Aquilonian military as a scout. So I'm going to put up a little map, magic. Here's the map. And I circled on the map, too, the area where this takes place in the Hyborian land. So you have Aquilonia as one of the biggest Western kingdoms. And the area that I've circled is an area that the Aquilonian military, they just won a major battle. They pushed back the Picts, which are kind of the Native Americans of Conan's time, right? The Aquilonians are like the civilized country. They pushed back the Picts. And now they've got this frontier that they're trying to hold. So they built forts along the frontier. And the Black River is one of the rivers in that contested space. And they're trying to hold it. And it's not easy, because the Picts are really fierce. And they have settlers that are trying to settle there and create homesteads. And then they have the military with forts trying to hold it down. So anyway, that's where it takes place. And a few years after this is when Conan actually takes place in a revolution and becomes king of Aquilonia, which is told in a pastiche novel written by, I think, L. Sprague de Camp and maybe Lynn Carter, called Conan the Liberator, which is actually a pretty good novel. And I'm going to do a whole show on the Conan pastiche, because I'm afraid to admit it, but I came to Conan through the pastiche stuff and then discovered Howard, which was interesting, but that's another show. Now, another interesting thing about this story is that the point of view character is not Conan. So it's just Conan and we're third person over his shoulder. We're actually point of view through a character named Balthus, who's a young guy who's come to Aquilonia to scope it out and see if he wants to settle there, maybe do a farmstead, maybe work at the fort. So it's a great opening where they start right out in the action. This guy Balthus is walking in the woods, and an arrow comes shooting over his shoulder. And Conan arrives on the scene, and he just kills a Pict, which probably would have killed Balthus. So even though he kind of, fancies himself a good woodsman, Conan puts him to shame because he came out of nowhere and killed this Pict. So he's kind of blown away. So this initial confrontation, they introduce each other, and Balthus is looking at Conan, and Conan's like, what are you doing here? We get kind of the lay of the land where Conan is scouting for his boss. So he's a mercenary, like I said, military contractor, right? He's paid by this guy, VAUGHAN'S, who is back in the fort, to kind of range around and scout and kind of, report back and give the skinny on where the Picts are and what's happening, if they're going to mass for attack, whatever. So we get a lot of information about what's going on. And here's some of the things. I'm going to read some of the passages from the story, because this is Conan in his classic military contractor, and this is what Conan is very smart, and he's very world savvy about what's going on around him. So this guy Balthus asks Conan, quote, "You're one of the fort's garrisons. I'm no soldier. I draw the pay and rations of an officer of the line, but I do my work in the woods." So there he is. And he's explaining to this guy, about the lay of the land. Quote, "The best land near Thunder River is already taken. Plenty of good land between Scalp Creek, you crossed it a few miles back, and the fort, but that's getting too devilishly close to the river. The Picts steal over to burn and murder, like that one did. They don't always come singly. Someday they'll try to sweep the settlers out of Conajahara, and they may succeed, probably will succeed. The colonization business is mad anyway. There's plenty of good land east of the Bossonian marshes. If the Aquilonians would cut up some of the big estates of their barons and plant wheat where now only deer are hunted, they wouldn't have to cross the border and take the land of the Picts away from them." End quote. Right? So savvy. The guy, he knows what's going on. He's very, very smart about the political situation there. And then a little bit more later on, quote, "Hey, it's nothing to me. I'm a mercenary. I sell my sword to the highest bidder. I never planted wheat and never will, so long as there are other harvests to be reaped with the sword. But you Hyborians have expanded as far as you'll be allowed to expand. You've crossed the marshes, burned a few villages, exterminated a few clans, and pushed back the frontier to Black River. But I doubt if you'll ever be able to hold what you've conquered. and you'll never push the frontier any further westward. Like, so Conan's like laying out, like, this is the deal. So, you know, and that's Conan, man. He's not, you know, hey, how's it going? Fine, how are you? Having a good day. Like, he's all business. And this is the core to me of Conan's character. He's a very business-like mercenary. This is kind of his deal. So then he kind of judges this guy Balthus, and he's like, I've seen good woodsmen from the Tauran, but the Bosonians have sheltered you Aquilonians from the outer wildernesses for too many centuries. You need hardening. Again, more understanding of his surroundings and what's going on. You know, like he really knows the deal. And we're getting the introduction of this Pictish wizard named Zogar Sag. So he's going to unite the clans, band them together to hopefully push the Aquilonians backward. And he's a wizard, so, you know, can do magic. So the two of them go back to the fort, and, you know, Conan reports in to VAUGHAN'S what the situation is, and he tells him, look, you know, this guy Zogar Sag is going to unite the clans, and you're dead meat, you know. So Conan is tasked by VAUGHAN'S with, okay, we'll go out and kill him. So he takes a small force, bails out, and there's this night attack where they cross the river, and the Picts ambush them, and Balthus is taken prisoner. So for a while, Conan isn't in the scene. Your point of view of Balthus, and you get this whole scene where he's captured, and Zogar Sag comes into the scene, and you're in the Pictish camp, and he summons these demons. The first time he summons saber-toothed tiger. By the way, there's going to be some spoilers. If you haven't read this story, there's a link in the description box where you can read it for free online. I would say go read it. It's an awesome story. And it's not very long. You probably read it in maybe 20 minutes, a half hour. But I'm going to spoil bits of it and pieces of it. So just to let you know. So from Balthus's point of view, we watch Zogar Sag, you know, summon these demons that come and, you know, do horrible things to the, you know, his captives, because he captured Balthus and other woodsmen. So it's bad news. And then he summons a snake, and the snake's about to kill Balthus, but Conan steps in, and then they escape, and they're heading back towards the fort on the way. So now, again, there's more instances of Conan's fieldcraft, right? And again, his military mercenary mind. So him and Balthus are now escaping. They're running back to the fort. The Picts are everywhere. And Conan says, quote, they'll be after us now. Zogar's discovered you're gone, and he knows my head wasn't in the pile before the altar hut. The dog. If I had another spear, I'd have thrown it through him before I struck the snake. Keep to the trail. They can't track us by torchlight, and there are a score of paths leading from the village. They'll follow those leading to the river first, throw a cordon of warriors for miles along the bank, expecting us to try to break through. We won't take to the woods until we have to. We can make better time on this trail. Blah, 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 blah. Quote, but there he is. He knows. He's never a character. When stuff happens to him, he's always like, all right, what do we know? What do we don't know? Where are we going? What are we going to do? He knows the enemy's mind, and he knows exactly what to do. So again, more towards, he's a military contractor. This is what he does. So the rest of the story kind of plays out pretty quickly. The Picts band together, they attack the fort, and then Conan has this wonderful battle with a demon, which I won't spoil it completely, but it turns the tide of the battle, even though he's not there. Very cool. And then Balthus goes off to defend. They get to this point where Balthus has to kind of warn the settlement that the Picts are coming. So he goes on this dead run with his dog, and he disappears and heads towards it. And then we're with Conan when he has this big battle with this demon. And then we cut. Next chapter is the aftermath, right? And we find out that, you know, Conan's actions actually turned the tide of the battle, which was going badly at the fort. And then he has a brief eulogy for Balthus, which I will read, which is really, really cool. So Balthus and the dog actually wound up doing a last stand. They protected and waylaid the Picts while a settlement was being evacuated. So he stood his ground on this road with the dog with a bunch of arrows, and they find him the next morning buried in a pile of Picts, and he died. Him and the dog died. And Conan says, he was a man, said Conan. I drink to his shade and to the shade of the dog who knew no fear. He quaffed part of his wine, then emptied the rest upon the floor with a curious heathen gesture and smashed the goblet. The heads of 10 Picts shall pay for his, and 7 heads for the dog, who was a better warrior than many a man. This is classic Conan, just, you know. Pretty much that's the story in general. But dispersed throughout the story, again, you get these wonderful passages through Balthus as the POV character about who Conan is. So I just want to read a couple passages because they're really cool. So at one point, when they leave the fort for the first time and heading into the Pictish wilderness, Balthus kind of takes Conan's measure, right? And he goes, quote, "They were wild men of a sort, yet there was still a wide gulf between them and the Cimmerian. They were sons of civilization, reverted to a semi-barbarism. He was a barbarian of 1,000 generations of barbarians. They had acquired stealth and craft, but he had been born to these things. He excelled them even in lithe economy of motion. They were wolves, but he was a tiger." It's classic Howard Conan. You can't get better than that. But then here are two sections that are really a little more introspective and interesting. First of all, Conan talking about himself. Balthus is kind of asking him, what's your deal? And so this is Conan telling Balthus who he is. Quote, "I've roamed far, farther than any other man of my race ever wandered. I've seen all the great cities of the Hyborians, the Shemites, the Stygians, and the Hyrcanians. I've roamed in the unknown countries south of the black kingdoms of Kush and east of the Sea of Viliat. I've been mercenary captain, a corsair, a Cossack, a penniless vagabond, a general. Hell, I've been everything except a king, and I may be that before I die. This is as good a life as any. I don't know how long I'll stay on the frontier, a week, a month, a year. I have a roving foot, but it's as well on the border as anywhere." So that's Conan talking about himself. And then they're together a lot, Conan and Balthus, right? And Balthus is kind of has a moment where he again apprehends Conan's character, and he says, so this is Balthus talking about himself. Quote, "He felt lonely in spite of his companion. Conan was as much a part of this wilderness as Balthus was alien to it. The Cimmerian might have spent years among the great cities of the world. He might have walked with the rulers of civilization. He might even achieve his wild whim someday and rule as king of a civilized nation. Stranger things had happened. But he was no less a barbarian. He was concerned only with the naked fundamentals of life, the warm intimacies of small kindly things, the sentiments and delicious trivialities that made up so much of civilized men's lives were meaningless to him. A wolf was no less a wolf because a whim of chance caused him to run with the watchdogs. Bloodshed and violence and savagery were the natural elements of the life Conan knew. He could not and would never understand the little things that are so dear to the souls of civilized men and women." And this is great because this is why Conan is not going to be done well on screen. Because to be around Conan is just like that guy who you're with who's just like, what are we doing next? All right, I'll go build a fire. Like, what else needs to get done? All right, I'm going to go do this. He's just going to, very practical. Maybe you get him in a tavern with a couple of drinks in him and he'll knock some people around or, go with a couple of wenches, as they call them in these stories. And that's who he is. So it's kind of the summary for me. First of all, I love the story because it shows him in that light, and I think that's who he really is. Now, this isn't as adventurous and exciting a story maybe as a lot of other Conan stories. It's great stories where he's going into lost cities. Red Nails is an amazing story where there's more magic and there's more. He's got a girl with him and he's getting out of scrapes. Indiana Jones. There's a lot of actually archaeological stuff with Conan, ruined temples and stuff like that, which is really cool. So there's a little bit of like a tomb robber thing going on with Conan at times. But this story is very matter of fact. There's magic in it. And magic does play a big role in the climax, obviously. But it's a great look at, to me, what the nature, the core of Conan really is. And why he's never going to be done well on screen, because this kind of a character does not have wide appeal. He doesn't have a dark past. He's not like, a son he never had, although he does have a son, I think, when he's a king. But like all those cliches of like what make heroes these days, or where heroes have to atone, whatever. He doesn't have any of those traits, so they have to graft things onto Conan often. If you're interested, I'm going to link below in the description box too. I produced a podcast for 4 or 5 years about genre film, and I have an episode where I compare the original John Millier's Conan with the Marcus Nispel new Conan, and the strengths and weaknesses of both and how they play off each other. So I'll link that down there if you're interested. Stay tuned because I'm going to do some more shows on Conan Howard for sure. But the next show I think I'm going to do on the pastiches of Conan. And the pastiche means all of the writers who wrote Conan who were not Robert Howard. And there's more pastiche stories and novels written about Conan than ever Howard wrote. So it's kind of interesting how that happened. I'm going to do links to Michael K. Vaughan's channel down there because he's got some great Robert E. Howard shows that are really awesome. And also the link to the story is down there too because that you should read. So anyway, that's it for the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.